Washington State University. Go Cougs!
Welcome back to the course on collecting smartphone sensor data using iOS. In part 5 of the first module, we'll be connecting our sensor app interface to the code in our View controller. Before we get into the actual Xcode, I wanted to say a few things about what we'll be doing. We've already seen that we've added labels and buttons to our interface, but we haven't actually connected them to change them or react to interaction with them. As we'll see, when we connect the label up to our code, we are going to be creating a variable, say message label, of type UI label. And the main thing we'll be doing with labels is changing the text that's displayed on the screen. And to do that, we would access the text property of the label and set it to a string. In terms of the buttons, we'll be creating variables of type UI button. And the main property we're interested in for buttons is whether they're enabled or not. As we'll see, when a button is enabled, it will be blue. When the is enabled is set to false, the button will appear in a gray color, which is an indication that tapping on it won't do anything. So we'll be doing this with our labels and buttons. In terms of actually accessing and detecting the interaction, we'll be creating what are called outlets and actions. Now, when we connect up our labels to our code, we'll be creating what are called outlets. And they'll be using this special keyword, this @IB outlet, and there'll be a variable of type UI label. Again, this will be created automatically for us when we make the connection. And as I mentioned down here, this connection is created by holding down the control key, clicking on the label in the storyboard, and then dragging it into the code. And at that point, it will create this variable definition for us. Likewise for actions, if we wanted to be able to detect interaction with one of our view elements, say a button, again, we would control click on the button and drag into the code, and that will create an IB action, which is going to be a function, and we'll give it a name. That function is passed in the element that was actually tapped or interacted with, and then we can add arbitrary code in order to implement the behavior we would like to see when the user taps that button. So again, we do this by control clicking, and just to give you a little bit more of an overview of that, so here's what's going to happen when we are going to connect up one of our labels. So we would control click on the label, drag into the code, and then this little window will pop up, which will say that we're going to create an outlet. We give it a name, and then when we hit connect, it'll create this variable for us, and that's the variable we'll use to change the text of that label, in this case to update the acceleration. And then as far as connecting up the actions for buttons, again, say we have the stop button down here, we would control click and drag into the code. That'll open up that window again. In this case, we change outlet to action, and we give our action a name. We would set the type, in this case to a button, the type of interaction we're interested in, which is usually touch up inside. And when we finish and hit connect, it will create, here's the one it created for the start button, essentially a function that allows us to insert code to implement that functionality. Okay, so let's go over to Xcode and start connecting up our elements to the code. So I'll start up Xcode and open up our sensor app. And here we are in our storyboard with our interface that we completed in the last part. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on this button up here, which is called the Assistant Editor. And what it'll do is it'll split the screen. We'll have the storyboard on the left and the code on the right. And that way we can click and drag from the storyboard into the code. So generally I like to click on this view controller to make sure I get the right view controller. Then we click on the Assistant Editor. And you can kind of see that the code is there, the storyboard is here, but we've got a lot of extra stuff on the screen. So I'm going to get rid of the rest of this so we have more screen to work with. First I'll get rid of this hierarchical view of our view by clicking this button. And then I'm going to get rid of my two side panels by clicking these buttons up here. Get rid of the left side panel, get rid of the right side panel, slide over my storyboard, give a little more room to my code. Okay, so now we're ready to start dragging our elements in and hooking up the various outlets and actions. Alright, so let's start off with acceleration, the X acceleration. Again, I hold down the control key and click and drag. And I want to drag inside my view controller class. Anywhere in here is fine, but generally we put the variables at the top. So when I let go, the window pops up. In this case, I'm going to choose outlet, the default. I'll give it a name, which I'll call it acceleration X label, and I want type UI label, storage is weak. Again, we'll accept the defaults there and hit connect. So when I hit connect, I see that it creates this outlet to the label, and so now when I make changes to this variable, they'll be reflected in the view. Okay, so we're going to need to do this for all of our labels that'll display information. So let's just go down the line and drag all of those in. So acceleration Y, I'll drag in. And acceleration Y label. Again, you can give these any names you want, but just to be consistent with the notes, I'll follow this pattern. Acceleration Z label, and same for the rotation. Call this first one rotation X label. Rotation Y label. And rotation Z label. And then for the location values, we'll do the latitude label. And the longitude label. And finally the altitude label. Okay, so that will give us access to these labels so that we can change them to give them the appropriate value as we measure it from the sensors. We also want to be able to change this message periodically, so I will control click on that and drag it in, and we'll call that our message label. Okay, so that's all of the labels we want access to. We also want access to our 3 buttons down here. And so there's 2 things we're going to need for the buttons. We want to detect when they're interacted with, but we also want to be able to change them, basically to enable them and disable them. So starting with in order to enable and disable them, we need an outlet to the button. So just as we did before, I'm going to control click and drag, and I'm going to make this the start button, and do the same for the stop button. You can note that it is an outlet, but it has correctly identified it as a button. So these types over here are buttons instead of labels. And lastly, the send button. Okay, so that will allow us to enable and disable them, but I also need to detect when they are tapped. So for that, we're going to be using an action instead of an outlet. So coming back to the start button, control click and drag. But this time, instead of outlet, I'm going to choose action. Notice that it provides the action option since it knows it's a button. I'll give it a name. I'll call it start tapped. And in general, for the type, I like to choose the most specific type available, in this case a button, so that when as you'll see, when it creates the function, it'll give the argument to that function a type of button, so we know what kind of element is coming in. And then for the type of interaction, you'll see there's lots of different interactions we can choose from, but generally the tapping of a button uses the touch up inside. So basically, as soon as your finger leaves the surface after having touched the button is when the action will be triggered. Okay, so let's hit connect, and you'll see that it creates this IB action function called start tapped, passes in a button, and then inside the code we can do whatever we need to do. We'll add a little bit in a second. But let's do the same for the other 2 buttons. So for stop button, again, I'll select action. I'll call it stop tapped, and I will choose the type button, connect that, and then lastly the send button, choose action, call it send tapped, and choose type button. Okay, so now we have all of the elements of our view. We have outlets to everything, and then we have the actions associated with the buttons, so we can detect when they're tapped. Okay, so next step, let's go to our Viewdidload. If you remember, Viewdidload is the kind of the first function that's called as we load the view and before it's displayed. So this gives us the ability to set the initial values for all of our labels and buttons if we want to set those. So what I want to do here is first I want to modify the message so that it says press start to begin. So to do that, I'm going to access my message label. You notice that it starts to auto-complete it for me, so I usually don't have to type the whole thing. Then when I hit the dot, it's going to give me the various choices I have for the properties and methods for a label. Quite a few of them there, but I know that the one I want is text, and then I set it to a string, press start to begin. Alright, So then when the view is loaded, this will be the message the user sees. Also, for the buttons, I want only the start button to be enabled. The other two shouldn't be enabled because the sensors haven't started yet. So just to make sure, I'm going to access the start button, and the property is enabled. I'm going to set that to true. And then the other two buttons I want to disable. So the stop button is enabled, set to false, and the send button is enabled, also set to false. Okay, so that will set up the initial view appropriately. And then the other thing we'll do is, obviously, eventually we want to change the labels to reflect the values of the sensors, but I'm going to, for now, just have the message reflect when we press the button. So inside our button functions here, I'm going to set our message to reflect that that button was tapped, and then of course change the enablement of the other buttons appropriately. So if the start button is tapped, we want to display a message that basically says the sensors are started. So that'll be the first thing I do, is set the text of the message label to sensors started. Obviously, we'll also in here want to actually start the sensors, but we'll save that for the next module where we actually learn how to access the sensors and start them up and stop them. Also, once we hit start and the sensors are started, then we want to disable the start button and enable the stop and the send button. So let's set the start button is enabled to false, and the other two buttons, the send button, will set in as is enabled to true, and same for the let's see, that was the send button. We also want to do the start button, or sorry, the stop button. So the stop button is enabled, set to true. Okay, so that will change the label and set the enablement of the buttons appropriately. Likewise, if the stop button is tapped, then we want to change the message to reflect that. So we'll say sensors stopped. Could also go ahead and say press start to begin, but we'll assume that the user will remember that. And then of course we want to set the button enablement back to having start enabled and the other two disabled. So I'm just going to copy, save some time, copy those three settings, but again start is now set to true, the others set to false. And then lastly, when we hit send, so the idea here is that as the sensor data is being collected, if we hit the send button, it will take the current set of the sensors and send them to the remote server. So most likely, and sometimes that may take a while since it'll be going out over the internet. So what we're going to do for now is just kind of fake it, essentially, and say that when we hit the send button, the message will say that it's sending the data. And then I'm going to call a function that I actually haven't implemented yet called send data. So that's probably going to give us an error here in a second since I can't find that one. So let me just go ahead and define that function real quick. And for now, all we're going to do is change the label to say that the data was sent. Eventually, we won't want this message to appear until the data is actually sent. So we'll be doing a lot more here once we send the data. But for now, we're essentially just faking it so that we can see a reaction to tapping the send button. Technically, we should also disable the send button because we don't want the user to be pressing it multiple times while we're trying to send the first one. So we'll go ahead and disable that button as well. And then once the data is sent, we'll go ahead and re-enable that button. Okay, so that's how we connect up the various values, the elements of our view, to the actual code from our view controller. Remember, this is our view controller class. And we also saw how we can connect the buttons to various functions to implement their behavior. So lastly, let's run this and so we can see it in action. Start up our iOS simulator. Okay, so there we see the initial view. We see that the start button is enabled. The other two are grayed out because they're disabled. And we have our initial message, which is press start to begin. So if I press on start, we see that the other buttons are now enabled. We get our sensors started. While I'm here, I can press send. And we see, normally it would say sending data ... but that went by so fast it pretty much just went straight to data sent. And then when I hit stop, it says sensor stopped, and again the buttons are enabled and disabled appropriately. Okay, so that completes the connection of our interface elements to the code. If we briefly go back to the notes. So obviously we still need to connect up the various sensor labels to the actual sensor values. So we will be doing that in the next module. But this completes the first module, our introduction to iOS. So congratulations. And basically you've seen an introduction to iOS, you've seen how to create an app, and you've seen the typical creation of the app interface where you're adding various labels and buttons and connecting those up to the code. So that's going to be pretty common in all of the apps you design. But for our particular app where we want to display sensor information, of course, the next step is to access that sensor data and display it on the screen. So we'll be doing that in the next module.